The Fuji Forest of Etrusca did not like to be watched. That was what Captain Elion Varis told his patrol every time the regiment drew the short twig and got assigned border duty along the slopes of Macha. The trees here were older than most of their bloodlines, and older trees remembered old wars. Their branches creaked like muttered curses whenever iron armor brushed too close, and the light between them never fully brightened, as if the sun itself understood that this corner of the country preferred shadows. "Shields up, eyes sharper," Elion said, voice low but carrying through the underbrush. "You are walking through ancestors' grudges." The patrol, 6 elves in powder blue, gold-gilded cuirasses, bearing the sigil of Etrusca, moved in a loose wedge. Nexum sigils glimmered faintly along their gear, runes etched into bracers, threads of mana and chakra work woven into their cloaks to soften the sound of step and breath. Etruscan archers, all of them, though each carried more than a bow. In these days, every soldier worth the name learned to draw on their chakras, to channel at least a flicker of Nexu through a nexus or two. The wind slid down the mountain in thin, cold fingers, carrying the smell of stone, sap, and something else. Something wrong. Saren, youngest of the patrol, slowed. A faint tremor of air brushed his cheek from the left, where the forest thickened around a rocky outcrop. Thumbed uncomfortably. His Nexum always whispered when danger approached, tugging at his ribs like a worried hand, his giver-type nexus itching to shield and warn. "Captain," Saren murmured, "do you feel that?" Elion lifted one hand, and the patrol froze. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and let his awareness slip inward, the way every trained Fae did when testing their Nexum flow. Root, grounded, a steady hum in his spine and legs, tying him to the mountain. Solar, a tight knot of heat in his gut, the place from which his enhancement-type nexus flared when he ordered his muscles to become more than flesh. Brow, a thin, pricking line between his eyes, where his senses sharpened beyond the merely physical, his manipulation nexus brushing the edges of perception. There, a ripple. As if the earth ahead had been hollowed and filled with stagnant Nexum, mana pooled and left to sour, pressing against a stone. "I feel it," Elion said. "Devaro, with me. The rest, bows ready. No loose heroics." Devaro, his second, gave a curt nod and moved up to his side. Devaro's primary nexus was range, his earth arrows able to split and reform mid-flight, striking multiple targets with eerie precision. Now he simply strung his bow and notched an arrow without drawing, pale hair tucked neatly behind long ears. They pushed through a screen of underbrush and found the stone. At first, it looked ordinary, a gray wall of jagged rock, streaked with pale quartz, half swallowed by moss. But as Saren and the others stepped closer, the illusion of normality wavered. The rock had a pattern, no, not natural striation. Lines, curving, intersecting lines that were almost runic, as if someone had carved vast Nexum circuits into the mountain and then let centuries of lichen try to hide them. At the center of the wall, a crack yawned in the stone, as tall as 2 elves, as narrow as a wound. A cold sigh spilled from it. Not the wind. The air itself seemed older inside that darkness, heavy with dust and something metallic. Mana prickled along Elion's skin. His Nexum reacted, chakras tightening. This place reeked of work Nexu, old Nexu, the sort that clung to sites where rituals had been carved into the bones of the world. Saren swallowed. "This wasn't on the survey maps, Captain. Mountains don't usually add new doors on a whim," Devaro said dryly. Elion stepped forward until he stood at the edge of the crack. Inside, the darkness shifted, not with light, but with gradations of black, as if space folded strangely a few steps beyond the threshold. He knew the stories, every elf in Etrusca did, of the Etrus Empire, of Cordonia, of the time when their people and the Fae had ruled the whole continent with Nexu and steel, of projects buried when the Dark War began, labs and prisons and vaults sealed and left to rot, rather than allow enemies to claim them. "Helm lamps," Elion said. His soldiers murmured short activation phrases, tiny crystals embedded in their brow guards flared with pale blue light, powered by modest trickles of Nexum from their chakras. Leon's own lamp ignited. casting a narrow beam into the crack. Could be an old mine, one of the archers, Lether suggested. Nervous humor edged his voice. Or smugglers finally got creative with their routes. No, Elion said. The word tasted like iron and ozone. This is older. His instincts told him to report back, to mark the site and let the Nexu Council's archivists pick at it from a distance with scrying and theories, their crown and brow Nexum doing the dangerous work, while his patrol stayed safely above ground. But he was an Etruscan officer. The border was his responsibility, and Etrusca did not like other races meddling in its lands. If he reported an unknown cave this close to the frontier, eventually someone from outside, some vampire or animori, or, stars forbid, a human, might be invited to investigate. The thought curdled his stomach. We go in, Elion decided, just far enough to see what we're dealing with. If it looks like a tomb of the Empire, we mark and fall back. If it's some contraband tunnel, we collapse it. No contact with outsiders, Devarro murmured, understanding. This is our forest. Our mountain, Elion corrected softly. Form up, 2 by 2. Do not touch anything that looks even slightly like a glyph. And if your Nexum starts screaming at you, you tell me, even if you think it's nothing. They moved. The crack swallowed them, stones scraping against their shoulders as they squeezed through. For a moment, the world narrowed to harsh breath and cold rock pressing at their armor. Then the passage widened, and they spilled into a stone throat sloping gently downward. The cave was not natural. The walls bore the same faint curved patterns as the outer rock. But here they were sharper, deeper, unsoftened by moss. Their helm lamps struck glimmers of crystal, studded in the ceiling like captured stars, long dormant but still humming faintly with residual Nexum. Elion touched one with gloved fingers. His heart lurched again, harder, as if the stone remembered pain. Enhancement warding, Devarro said, studying the lines. Layered. They wove their Nexum through an enhancement-type nexus, meant to reinforce the stone from inside. This was meant to keep something in, not out. Better, Lether muttered. If it had kept us out too, they moved deeper. The air grew colder, the distant drip of water echoing like a slow heartbeat. The corridor twisted, sometimes narrowing to a crawl, sometimes opening into small chambers lined with shelves carved from stone. On those shelves, dust lay thick as velvet. Whatever jars or tools had once rested there were long gone, leaving only faint circular outlines and forgotten impressions. Old Empire work, whispered Alira, the squad's only sage in training. Her Nexu ran deep into crown and brow, her sage-style nexus more spiritual than martial. I can feel echoes through the Nexum in the stone. Fear, pride. They walked these halls with purpose. And did they walk out again? Lether asked. Elion didn't answer. The corridor bent once more, and then spilled into a true chamber, larger than any they'd yet seen. Their lamps picked out the edges first, a circle of standing stones arranged around a central dais. Each stone was carved with those same curved sigils, but here they blazed intact and untouched, as if time itself had been forbidden entry. The air in the chamber felt thick, pressing against their ears and chests, Nexum heavy and stagnant. In the middle of the dais lay a ring of metal, dark, dull, and yet somehow deeper than the shadows around it. It pulsed faintly with violet light, as if in response to their presence. Elion's gut screamed, his Nexum trying to drag him backward. Fall back, he snapped, even as part of him wondered at the power humming through the room. Now, this is a binding circle. We've stepped into a prison. Alira took a single, involuntary step toward the ring. Her eyes had gone unfocused, lips moving, as if reciting words no one else could hear. Nexum gathered around her crown like a pale, invisible crown of fire. Alira, Elion barked. She didn't respond. The ring pulsed again, brighter. Every strand of Nexum in the room flared with it. Saren doubled over, clutching his chest as his body spasmed. Lether stumbled back into the wall, arrows skittering across stone as his range-type nexus flickered and choked. Something inside the circle moved. Not flesh, not quite shadow. As if a piece of night had been peeled from the ceiling and laid on the stone. It flowed like smoke and yet maintained a shape, limbs, a suggestion of a face, eyes like hollow amethysts. A Bound Eidolon, Elion realized with a horror that tasted like old stories, half whispered around winter fires. A fragment of something that should have remained myth. The Etruscan Empire's worst sins had often worn chains like these. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was not a roar, not a word, just a pressure that shattered silence into knives. Nexum itself shuddered in the air. Illyra screamed, not in pain, in resonance. Her chakra blazed white in Elion's sight, as if someone had ripped it open like a door and tied her nexus directly to the thing in the circle. Elion, Devaro's voice cut through the chaos. Orders! The Eidolon's eyes turned toward them, drawn like a moth to their Nexum signatures. The sigils on the stones flared, fighting to hold it in place, but cracks spiderwebbed through the light. Retreat! Elion shouted, grabbing Illyra by the collar and hauling her back with all the enhanced strength he could muster through his battered solar nexus. Bows, loose, then run. Aim for the sigils, disrupt the circle. Arrows flew, guided by range-type nexuses, tips sparking with hastily summoned Nexu. Sigils shattered, and the mountain remembered screaming. By the time they saw the sky again, Elion's lungs were on fire, and 3 of his soldiers were dead. The first had been Lethier. The moment one of the glowing sigils shattered under their arrow fire, the bound fragment in the circle had reached, beyond its prison, not with hands, but with warped Nexum. The air itself had become claws. Lethier had been closest. 1 second he was running. The next he was a smear of red and twisted metal across the stone. His enhancement nexus snuffed like a candle. The second and third fell as the passageways warped. The cave had not liked them, or perhaps the thing bound within had reached into the mountain's memory, twisting Nexum lines in the stone into spirals and traps. Devaro had taken an arrow to the thigh from his own bow, turned by a sudden curve in the wall. Saren had vanishing footing where there should have been floor, his root connection sabotaged. By the time they reached the crack of daylight, only 3 remained running. Elion, Devaro, and Illyra. The Eidolon's pressure followed them like a storm front, tugging at their chakras, trying to pull their Nexum back. At the threshold, Elion felt the mountain's ancient warding snap fully awake. Old lines of Nexum surged, triggered by whatever the imperial binders had predicted might happen someday. Light exploded behind them, not bright but deep, violet and white, and black all at once. Raw Nexu discharging through the ward lines, Elion shoved Devaro and Illyra through the crack and flung himself after them. The world inverted. For a heartbeat, he felt every chakra in his body flare and then slam shut as if slapped. Root cut, sacral frozen, solar doused. His Nexum went silent, channels clamping closed. He hit the moss outside with a bone-jarring impact and lay there, gasping like a fish dragged from the river. Silence. No, not silence. The forest sobbed around them, branches creaking, leaves shivering as if a wind only they could feel had torn through. Nexum in bark and root, shuddering in sympathy. Illyra, Elion croaked. She lay crumpled near him, limbs twisted at odd angles. Her eyes stared up at the canopy, wide and unseeing. A faint trickle of blood stained the corner of her mouth. Her chakra, once bright, was an empty, echoing hollow. He knew she was gone before he reached for her pulse. Devaro lay a few strides away, half curled around his leg. Bone jutted white from a tear in his thigh armor. His face had gone the color of ash bark. Elion, he rasped. Report says 3 survivors. 1 is a liar. Elion would have laughed if he'd had breath. Stay still, he said instead, sliding to his side. Even without Nexum to bolster him, his training took over. He ripped strips from his own cloak and bound Devaro's thigh, hands slick with blood. You're not dying on a rock under some nameless tree. We have treaties to argue and officers to insult. Devaro's lips twitched, and a report to write. Sir, recommendation, do not disturb the abyss. It's Nexum bites. Elion's hands stilled for a moment. In the cave, right before the mountain had thrown them out, he had seen the bind lines flare one last time, as if the prison had sealed itself again. Had they repaired the damage by raking the sigils? Had the wards taken their soldiers' Nexum as fuel? He did not know. He only knew that something old and hungry now knew that the world outside its stone cradle still existed and had tasted elven chakras. Captain? Devaro's eyes fluttered. Are we... Elion looked back at the crack in the rock. It was smaller now. Where once it had stood tall enough for two elves, the opening now sagged, stone folding in like scar tissue. The faint pattern carved into the surrounding wall had dimmed, as if whatever Nexum had once surged there had retreated deeper into the bones of the forest. No light flickered within, no breath of cold air spilled out. To anyone else, it would look like an old rockfall, a minor collapse in a nameless cliff. Yes, Elion said softly, just us. He closed Alira's eyes with blood-stained fingers, murmuring the old words under his breath, feeling the hollowness where her crown Nexu had once brushed his in training. Then he lifted Devarro. It should have been impossible without his enhancement Nexus active. Devarro was a grown elf in full gear, bleeding and half-conscious, but rage, grief, and sheer Etruscan stubbornness wrapped themselves around Elion's bones. Muscles strained, his back screamed. His Nexum, dampened and sluggish, lent him only the faintest flicker of help. But he stood. Step by step, he carried his friend down the mountain. The journey back to Haville blurred into a smear of trees and pain. Sometimes they walked. Sometimes Elion dragged a crude litter behind him. Sometimes Devarro walked with his arms slung over Elion's shoulders, teeth clenched against pain. By the time the city's white spires pierced the horizon, both of them were little more than half-conscious ghosts in dented armor. The guards at the gates stared when they staggered in. By the roots, one breathed. Captain Varis, what happened? The forest near Macha, Elion said, voice scraped raw. Unknown imperial facility. Only 2 returned. My Nexum is partially deadened. I require immediate audience with the High Marshal and a healer for Lieutenant Devarro. They did not argue. The chamber of the High Council of Etrusca was carved from living stone in Haville's heart, its ceiling a lattice of silver branches that caught and reflected mage light. Elion stood at the center of the circular floor, armor cleaned but still bearing faint scars of the cave, his left arm bound from wrist to elbow. Devarro slept in the palace infirmary, legs stabilized, and slowly knitting under careful hands and healer Nexu. Around him, the elders of Etrusca sat in tiered seats, their hair braided with silver and leaves, their faces carved from the same stone as the walls. The High Marshal, Bareth Alun, sat closest, his eyes like twin chips of obsidian. You say an imperial ruin, Varith said, and yet no archivist has record of such a site outside Macha. Respectfully, Marshal, the Empire had many secrets, Elion replied. He had repeated the tale 3 times already, for healers, for scribes, for lower officers. Each telling carved the memory deeper, made the screams in his head sharper, and the echo of twisted Nexum louder. This was built to be forgotten. The bindings were not meant for casual study. Describe the entity again, one of the counselors said. Lady Isilra, whose Nexu ran deep into crown and brow, giving her a reputation for reading more than words, and for sensing the flavor of a person's Nexum when they lied. A Bound Eidolon, Elion said. The term tasted like old ashes, not full-bodied, a shard, a fragment, but powerful enough to warp the stone around it when disturbed. Reached for us through our Nexum channels, tested our Nexus patterns. Alira, our sage, was touched first. It burned her from the inside. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Bound Eidolons were nightmares from the Empire's later years. Stories of experiments where fragments of creatures from the void between were anchored to the world with obscene Nexum and used as weapons. Most had been destroyed when Cordonia fell, or so everyone had chosen to believe. And the prison? Varith asked. Stable? I believe the ward lines resealed when we escaped, Elion said. The mountain itself intervened. The crack shrank. The thing knows we exist now. And it knows the bindings can be tested. Then we collapse the mountain, snarled one of the younger counselors. Seal it in a tomb. It will never claw through. Nexum or no Nexum, elves live near that mountain, Isilra said sharply. Villages, farms, old groves. We cannot just drop a peak on our own people because of a soldier's fear. Elion's jaw tightened. Fear is what keeps borders safe, counselor. Nexu without fear is how the Empire fell. Varith lifted a hand. Enough. Whether or not we bury it is a decision for another day. His gaze fixed on Elion. For now, we must know what we face. A patrol is not equipped for such work. Elion's stomach curled. You propose what? An expedition, Varith said. A guild-sanctioned delve. Warriors, elementals, sages, magi, all trained for such ruins. We issue a request through every recognized guild in Etrusca, perhaps beyond if necessary. Beyond? Elion's voice went thread-thin. Isura's lips thinned. Do not be dramatic, Captain. The Nexu Council itself bears non-elven members. We may dislike other races, but even we must admit they occasionally know how to poke at old scars without killing themselves. Elion's hands curled into fists. Images flashed in his mind. Human hands touching Etruscan stone. Werebeast boots trampling old elven glyphs. Ghouls with their Sakun organs flexing in the dim light of a cave that belonged to his ancestors. The idea that outsiders might set foot where his own soldiers had died made his chest ache. Etrusca has enough talent, he ground out. We do not need the races of Fae or their pets. Our Nexu is not lacking. Varith regarded him for a long moment. You are wounded and grieving, Captain, but in this, I agree. We will first give our own guilds the chance to respond. If none accept, we will reconsider our arrogance. He rose, the motion fluid despite his age. Prepare the formal requests, he told the scribes. Classified as high hazard. Imperial ruin, unknown depth, confirmed lethal. Nexum instability. Reward commensurate with risk. Elion swallowed. Sir, permission to accompany the expedition, to guide them. Denied, Varith said without hesitation. Elion stared. But you are compromised, the marshal said. Your Nexum dampened by whatever ward you triggered. Your root and solar chakras are not fully responsive. You have not yet recovered, and your judgment is clouded by loss. We cannot risk another officer, trained in border defense, on what may be a one-way descent. Your duty is here. You will remain. The words hit like a blow. Elion bowed slowly, each inch a rebellion pressed into obedience. As you command, Marshal. The job posting went out that evening. By dawn, word of the cave beneath Macha had spread to every guild hall in Etrusca, from the elemental sanctums of Elvenwood to the shadowed bastions of Skane Harbor, from the ivory spires of Rome to the hidden enclaves beneath Naples. Most read the description and turned the page. High hazard, unknown binding, imperial ruin, confirmed losses, Nexum anomalies. The pay was good, but not good enough to tempt those who had already survived their share of near deaths. In a world where Nexu could twist on a whim, and the legacy of the Empire still smoldered, even elves learned to recognize curses when they saw them. In the end, only one guild accepted. The message arrived in Haville on a slip of gilded parchment, sealed with a sigil of intertwined thorns. The Silverthorn Vanguard would go where others would not, and they would take 5 of their best. The Silverthorn Vanguard's banner snapped in the wind outside Haville's north gate, a circle of braided brambles on a field of deep green, threaded through with a single silver arrow. The guild hall lay in Etrusca's eastern reaches, near Elvenwood, but when a high-hazard commission came from the council itself, distance became a mere inconvenience. Elion watched their approach from the parapets, knuckles white on the stone. They look capable, one of the gate wardens murmured beside him. They look young, Elion replied. 5 elves. All carried themselves with the easy confidence of veterans, but he could see the space between them, that gap between scar and arrogance, where a person still believed they could walk into darkness and dictate how they would walk out. Elion had lived in that gap once. The cave had closed it with blood and stolen Nexum. The first to cross beneath the gate was their leader, a woman with hair like winter sunlight and eyes the color of pine needles. Her armor was practical, but fine, scales of dark leather interspersed with plates etched in curling designs. A long, curved blade rested at her hip, and a Nexu-touched bow rode over one shoulder. This had to be Elion Thorn, Silverthorn's captain, an elemental whose Nexu style combined earth with ability crystals, with a manipulation and range nexus blend that let her call roots from stone and arrows from air. Beside her walked Calum Celis, a quiet figure in layered robes, his hair braided back in intricate loops. A magi by training, his brow and crown chakras tuned to the hidden geometries of Nexum in the world. He carried a staff bound with crystals that hummed even from the wall, set to amplify and shape group Nexu. Behind them came the others. Mern Vael, a battle mage with enhancement nexus and fire burning bright in his solar, broad-shouldered and grinning like he just won a bet with fate. Nissa Elion, an enchanter, her chakra marked by the faint drifting halo of mana that followed her voice. She wore mithril-threaded gloves and bore a bandolier of vials, each glowing a different color, spellglass to hold temporary Nexum patterns. And Aaron Lathis, the youngest, a healer-sage hybrid, whose giver nexus and faint crown alignment made him a rare blend, part battle medic, part spiritual anchor. He carried a shield almost too big for his frame, and a pack that clinked with bottles and herbs. 5. Elion wondered which 3 would come back. The council received them in the same chamber where Elion had given his report. This time, he stood at the perimeter, no longer the center of the circle. His armor felt suddenly too heavy. His presence felt unnecessary, yet he refused to leave. Lyrian bowed with crisp precision. Captain Lyrian Thorn, representing the Silverthorn Vanguard, at your service. High Marshal, counselors. Your prompt response is appreciated, Varith said. You have read the details of the assignment? Lyrian's gaze flicked briefly toward Elion before returning to the Marshal. We have. Imperial ruin, possible Bound Eidolon fragment, confirmed casualties. Nexum instability. Objective, assess threat, retrieve any unstable Nexu artifacts, and if possible, reinforce or repair existing bindings. And if not possible, Isora asked. Lyrian smiled without humor. Then we run like cowards and recommend you collapse the mountain, my lady. A few of the older counselors frowned at her tone. Elion felt a faint, bitter warmth. At least someone was saying aloud the grim options he'd only thought. Calum stepped forward, staff held loosely. We've studied the few remaining records on binding circles of that complexity. Most came from the late Etruscan Empire, during the last century before the Dark War. They were careless with what they pulled through the veil, and reckless with the Nexum they poured into their work. Megalomaniacs, Theron added cheerfully. But clever ones, always the worst combination. And you believe you can handle what they left behind? Varith asked. Handle is a strong word, Nissa said. We can look at it without immediately dying. That's more than most can promise. Aaron shifted, clearly uncomfortable with the banter. We'll do everything we can to keep each other alive, and to keep whatever is down there from spreading through the Nexum near Macha. His eyes flicked to Elion. There was no judgment there, only quiet resolve. Varith followed the glance. Captain Varis will guide you to the cave's entrance, the Marshal said. He knows the route, though he is not authorized to enter again. Lyrian's brows rose slightly. Our guild usually handles navigation internally, Marshal. Elion stepped forward before Varith could answer. Macha is my patrol. My soldiers died in that cave. I'll see you to its mouth at least. After that, you can decide whether you want to follow ghosts deeper. Lyrian studied him for a heartbeat, measuring the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the sluggishness in his Nexum signature. Very well, she said. We accept your guidance to the threshold, and your story on the way. They left Haville at dawn. Mist clung to the lowlands, turning the fields into drifting islands of gold and green. The Silverthorn 5 moved with the easy rhythm of those who had spent more time on the road than in their beds, packs balanced, weapons accessible, senses tuned. Elion rode at the front, his horse a steady gray that knew the mountain paths better than he did. Lyrian rode beside him, reins held in a loose, confident grip. The others followed in a staggered line, Calum muttering to his crystals, Theron humming an old marching tune, Nissa tossing a coin in the air with lazy precision, Aaron watching everything with wide, solemn eyes. You were there when the bindings shook, Lyrian said, as they left the last farms behind, and the forest swallowed the road. Tell me exactly what you felt, through your Nexum, not just your skin. Elion exhaled slowly. It began as pressure. The air in the chamber thickened when we entered, as if we were walking into water. My Nexum reacted immediately, root and solar flaring, heart uneasy. The binding circle in the center pulsed with violet light. Our sage heard something. That would be a Lyra? Calum asked from behind. Yes, Elion said, voice catching briefly on her name. She walked toward the circle as if drawn. Her chakra flared. It looked like someone had hooked a line through her crown and pulled, trying to force a new nexus on her. Lyrian frowned. Compulsion riding Nexum. The Eidolon was testing for compatible nexus signatures. Or for food, Theron said. If you're a bound fragment, do you really care what you're doing? Nissa flicked her coin, caught it on the back of her hand, peeked, and made a face. Void take you there. That's exactly the kind of optimism we needed. Aaron rode in silence, lips pressed together, his fingers flexed occasionally, as if feeling for a heartbeat that wasn't there. When we broke the sigils, Elion continued, the pressure snapped. It reached for us through the cracks, not physically, through our Nexum. Our enhancement and range channels choked. Bodies tried to move. Nexum refused to flow. The mountain reacted. The wards triggered a failsafe. It felt like being flung through a ritual circle without preparation. Every chakra yanked at once. Calum nodded thoughtfully. Many imperial binders layered panic wards into their prisons. If release was imminent, the structure would attempt to reset by ejecting nearby Nexum signatures. Not exactly gentle about it, of course. Of course, Theron echoed. Why make an emergency exit that doesn't break your bones and half your nexus? You still feel any dampening? Lyrian asked Elion quietly. Since then? Yes, Elion said. My Nexum hasn't fully returned. I can sense root faintly, but solar and brow are sluggish, as if someone wrapped them in wet cloth and tied knots in the flow. He hesitated. There's also a dream. Lyrian's gaze sharpened. Go on. Sometimes, when I sleep, I see a circle of stones, the same as in the cave. But the sigils are broken. A ring of metal lies empty, and something is walking through the forest, the shadow with my face. Its Nexum feels like mine, but wrong. He forced a shrug. Likely just nerves. Calum and Lyrian exchanged a glance. Or the Eidolon tasting you, Calum murmured, reaching through resonance. The binding may have marked your Nexum even as it threw you out. Comforting, Elion said dryly. Better you than us, Theron said. He grinned when Aaron glared at him. What? He survived once. Clearly the cave likes his Nexu style. The cave took his people, Aaron said quietly. That's not liking. That's playing. The road narrowed as they began to climb. Trees thickened, their trunks twisting in ways that suggested old Nexu scars, where elementals had once lost control. Birdsong faded, replaced by the hush of wind and the occasional creak of boughs. By midday, human settlements were far behind. Only Etruscan wardstones marked the path now, thin pillars of white granite, etched with the country S crest, their dormant sigils faintly glowing as the guild party passed, briefly tasting their Nexum. You ever worked with non-elves? Nissa asked Elion at one point, perhaps from boredom as much as curiosity. No, Elion said. And I hope to keep it that way. Xenophobic, are we? She teased. Elves remember, Elion said. Humans forget, fairies bury, vampires pretend they were never part of the problem. The last time we opened imperial ruins to outsiders, the great divide in Alps Bay hadn't yet healed. Nexu does not care what ears hear the wrong word, but people do, so we keep our dangers mostly our own. Nissa's coin flashed again. Fair enough. Besides, Elion added, if we invited others in and they survived, we would owe them. Etrusca does not enjoy debt, Nexum or otherwise. Lyrian's lips twitched. On that, we agreed. They reached the lower slopes of Macha as the sun began to tilt toward afternoon. The air cooled, turning sharp and thin. Elion's horse picked its way along familiar stones. Finally, he drew rein and raised a hand. Here, he said. They dismounted. Before them, half hidden by undergrowth, rose the rock wall. It looked almost exactly as Elion remembered, except the crack was smaller. the lines carved into the stone dimmer. Nexum sunk deeper. Lyrian stepped closer, brushing aside hanging vines. Her fingertips traced the faint sigils. Old Empire script, Kayla murmured, joining her. But not one I recognize. They layered newer glyphs over the older language. Sloppy, overconfident, Lyrian corrected. They thought the old bindings would hold even with their modifications. They were wrong. Elion's chest tightened. The memory of stepping through that crack, the weight of the cave's breath slammed into him. His subdued Nexum quivered. "This is as far as I go," he said. "Orders." Lyrian turned to face him fully. "We'll send word when we return," she said. Elion held her gaze. "If you return." Something like respect flickered in her eyes. "If we return." Aaron stepped forward, surprising them both. "Captain," he said softly, "with your permission." He raised a hand, hovering it a few inches from Elion's chest. Light, soft, green gold, flickered around his fingers, gentle and probing, shaped by his giver nexus. Elion hesitated, then nodded. Aaron's eyes drifted shut. For a moment, Elion felt the faintest brush of warmth inside himself, like sunlight trying to penetrate a shuttered window. Then Aaron opened his eyes, grim. "The dampening in your Nexum is tangled," he said, "like a knot of threads tied around your root and solar. So I try to pull too hard, something on the other end might pull back. The binding still has a hook in you." "Aib it," Elion said immediately. The idea of giving the cave another tug line into his chakras made his skin crawl. Aaron nodded. "I just thought you should know. It remembers you, and it may listen for you, and I'll be very quiet," Elion said. Lyrian adjusted her bow. "Mount guard here," she told him. "If we do not return by sunrise 2 days from now, assume the worst. Recommend full containment, or collapse." Elion swallowed. Understood. He stepped back as the Silverthorn 5 formed up at the crack. Lyrian went first, slipping through the narrow opening with the grace of someone who had been walking into trouble since childhood. Theron followed, then Nissa, Calum, and Aaron last, his hand brushing the stone as if in apology, Nexum humming uneasily. One by one, they vanished into the mount. The forest exhaled. Elion remained alone at the threshold, listening to the quiet, feeling the faint throb of his own damaged Nexum. "Don't take them," he whispered to the rock. The rock did not answer. Only the old buried Nexu in its heart stirred, remembering the taste of new souls. Inside the mountain, the world changed. Lyrian felt it the moment she crossed fully into the cave's throat. The temperature dropped not in degrees, but in quality. The cold here was old, the kind that seeped past armor and skin to rest against bone and chakra alike. Light from their helm lamps stabbed forward, catching in the crystals studded above like scattered stars. The same faint curved patterns marked the walls, sharper and more deliberate than the erosion outside. Nexum lines etched deep. "Stay close," Lyrian said, her voice steady. "No wandering. Theron, you take rear. Nissa, middle. Calum, with me." "And me?" Aaron asked, already reaching for the small, glowing orb at his belt. "You stay alive and keep the rest of us that way," Lyrian said. "If you see something we don't, through Nexum or otherwise, sing out." He nodded. They moved. The initial corridor matched Elion's description, sloping gently downward, bending occasionally, as if following some buried vein of ore or old Nexum channel. Calum's staff hummed quietly, the crystals at its head casting soft secondary light that seemed to outline sigils invisible to the naked eye. "Feel that?" he murmured. "Yes," Lyrian said. "The bind lines. They're still active." "The Empire poured obscene amounts of Nexum into these structures," Calum said. "They siphoned from captured elementals, sages, anyone with a strong nexus, anything they could chain. Even centuries later, the echo remains. Let's hope they left some instruction manuals lying around," Nissa muttered. They passed the first side chamber, shelves empty, dust thick. Theron peeked in, shrugged, and moved on. Aaron lingered only long enough to note that the air there felt marginally lighter, as if fewer souls had screamed their Nexu into the stone. "Captain," he said after another few minutes, "my heart chakra is Uneasy. Mine too, Lyrian admitted. The bindings are wrong. This wasn't built for protection. It was built as a cage, and cages always plan for failure. They reached the main chamber more quickly than Elion had, though Lyrian suspected that had little to do with speed. The cave remembered the path now. The bindings wanted them to arrive. The space opened around them, swallowing their lamplight. A circle of standing stones rose from the floor, each monolith carved in dense, overlapping glyphs. The sigils glowed faintly, less bright than in Elion's memory, but far from dormant. Nexum hummed through them like a trapped, injured animal. In the center, on the dais, lay the ring. It was wrong to look at, dull metal that seemed to eat light. Yet at its edges, a thin violet corona pulsed, faint and irregular, like a dying heartbeat in Nexum form. Lyrian's throat tightened. For a moment, she felt pressure behind her eyes, a whisper curling around her brow chakra. You knew. She took a slow breath and tightened her root. Ground. Remember who you are. Remember your Nexu style is yours, not its. Calum? She said quietly. He stepped forward, staff held horizontally in both hands. His chakra flared, eyes going distant as he opened himself to the geometry of the bindings. The crystals on his staff brightened, casting rune-shaped reflections across the floor as his magi nexus mapped patterns in the air. Oh, he whispered, that's not good. Define not good in terms of survival, Aaron said. The binding circle is fractured, Calum said. See these 3 stones? He gestured. Those are the primary anchors. One's cracked. Another has a sigil partially burned. The third is patched. Patched with what? Nissa asked. Panic word Nexum, Calum said. When the failsafe triggered, when it threw the soldiers out, it cannibalized part of its own structure to close the breach. He swallowed, which means it's holding for now, but its integrity is compromised. Another shock to the Nexum flow could tear it. How much is another shock? Lyrian asked. Us standing here, breathing, looking at it funny? Probably more than that, Calum said. But if we tried to dismantle or reinforce the circle without fully understanding its design, we could trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent. Reassuring, Nissa said. Love that for us. Aaron edged closer, stopping just outside the etched outer circle. He could feel something pressing against his heart, like fingers testing the glass of a jar, tasting his giver nexus. It's awake, he murmured. Not fully, like someone trapped under ice. But it's listening through the Nexum. Then speak to it, Theron said. Tell it to go back to sleep. That's not how Bound Eidolons work, Calum said. They don't sleep. They wait. The fragment pinned here is a sliver of something that exists mostly elsewhere. The Empire anchored it with a circle that touches our world and the void between. The binding is like a hook of Nexum. The chain leads away. And if the hook bends or breaks? Lyrian asked. Calum's silence was answer enough. All right, Lyrian said. Options. We can't leave it as is. We also can't risk improvising repairs on a structure we barely understand. Nissa chewed her lower lip. We could siphon some of the accumulated Nexum from the circle into a containment crystal, she said. Not the Eidolon itself. That's beyond us, but the excess charge. It might relieve some of the pressure on the damaged anchors. And if that destabilizes the flow pattern? Calum asked. Then we die messily, she said, but gently. I'll make sure it's quick. Theron snorted. If we do nothing, we still die. Just later, and with more screaming villagers when the Nexum tears loose. Lyrian weighed the options like blades in her hands. Etrusca's forests, the villages around Macha and Haville, the Empire's sins leaking back into a world already strained by the Great Divide's scars. We weren't hired to walk in, gawk, and walk out, she said. We make a move. Her gaze shifted to Aaron. What's your instinct? He started. Mine? Yes, Lyrian said. You listen with a different part of Nexum than we do. What does your heart say? He closed his eyes. Center of compassion, connection, balance between body and spirit. It thrummed in his chest like a cautious bird. His giver nexus hovered near, ready to pour or mend. He reached out, not physically, but with that invisible sense, and brushed the edge of the circle. Cold slammed back into him. Not physical cold, absence. A void so complete it bent around the edges, creating a sick parody of gravity. He felt minds flattened into patterns, souls stretched into weapon shapes. He felt the Empire's pride woven through every line, a declaration, we will bind what the gods feared, no matter the Nexum cost. He also felt fatigue. The fragment was tired, not in its essence that existed beyond such small concepts, but its connection here was frayed. It had strained against the bindings for centuries and found no purchase. When the soldiers had stumbled in, when Alira's crown had flared, it had surged, only to be slammed back again. It wanted out, but it did not yet know how. Aaron opened his eyes, heart hammering. If we do nothing, he said, it will find a way. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. It's learning the pattern of its cage. The cracked anchor gives it leverage through Nexum. Lyrian nodded once. Decisions settled like armor around her shoulders. Nissa, you handle the siphon, she said. Calum, you map the pattern as she works. Therein, you watch for structural shifts. If anything moves that shouldn't, stone, glyph, light, reality, you shout. Aaron, you stay with me. If it reaches for anyone, you cut the Nexum line if you can. Aaron's mouth went dry. And if I can't, then you pull us back, Lyrian said. Even if we scream otherwise. He nodded. Nissa stepped up to the circle's edge, careful not to let her boots cross the inscribed boundary. She drew a crystal prism from her bandolier, its facets clear and unmarked. Fresh as a newborn, she murmured. Let's see how you like imperial leftovers. She whispered an activation phrase. The crystal flared softly, then brightened as she extended her throat Nexu into it, weaving a song-shaped channel that brushed the outer flows of Nexum in the binding circle. Mana and chakra surged. It was not gentle. Violet light roared along the glyph lines, pouring toward the crystal. Nissa grimaced, knees bending as if under sudden weight, Calum said sharply, staff humming as he traced counter runes in the air. If you yank, it'll... The floor shuddered. For a heartbeat, Lyrian thought it was a simple tremor. Then the ring in the center pulsed, not faintly, but with blinding intensity. The violet light that had been confined to its edges flared. The sound that followed was not human, not natural. It was pressure turned into noise, despair given a voice. The circle of stones groaned, glyphs cracking. One of the anchors split from base to tip, a jagged line of darkness racing up its side as Nexum overloaded. Nissa screamed. The crystal in her hand went from clear to deep purple in an instant, then shattered, shards embedding in her palm and cheek. Aaron, Lyrian shouted. He was already moving. He slammed his hand against Nissa's shoulder, pouring stabilizing Nexum into her channels. The uncontrolled surge snapped, redirected into his own heart. Agony lanced through his chest, but he anchored it, forcing the wild Nexum to ground through his root into the stone. The Eidolon noticed. Violet eyes, hollow, pit deep, blinked open above the ring. It was not fully formed, a shape of night and fracture, limbs stretched wrong. But its gaze pinned Lyrian, Calum, Theron, Nissa, Aaron all at once through their Nexus signatures. You knew. Lyrian's elemental Nexu roared in response. Roots sprouted from the stone at her feet, racing toward the ring, trying to hold the forming shape. Theron's fire flared to life, a burning sword in his hand, his enhancement Nexus pushing his body beyond its limits. Calum slammed his staff down, crystals blazing as he invoked counter circles, overlaying new Nexum patterns atop the old. The bind lines shrieked. For a moment, the Eidolon's form tore between shapes, flickering as the ancient circle fought its birth, and the guild's interference tugged at its chains. Its mouth opened again, wider than a skull could allow. This time, the sound had words, not in any tongue of Midgardum, but the Nexum in their bodies understood. The lights went out, swallowed them. Not the absence of light, the negation of it. For a heartbeat, Lyrian felt as if her eyes had been removed, her senses stripped down to the raw hum of her chakras. Her helm lamp flickered back, sputtering. One by one, the other's light sources returned, though dimmer, as if struggling against a heavy pressure in the Nexum around them. The chamber had changed. The circle of stones still stood, but two of the anchors had crumbled, toppled inward like felled trees. The ring lay cracked, its surface split by jagged fractures that bled violet light. The Eidolon had grown. It now stood as tall as 3 elves, a figure of shadow sculpted into something like a body, limbs too long, fingers tapering into tendrils that frayed at the edges. Its head was a featureless oval except for the eyes, which blazed with shifting colors, violet indigo, a sickly pale green. Chains of light still wrapped around its limbs, anchoring it to the circle. But some had snapped, dangling loose and flickering, Nexum unmoored. "Status!" Lyrian barked, forcing her voice to cut through the suffocating pressure on their Nexum. "Alive," Darren grunted, bracing himself with his sword. "Currently regretting my life choices." "Conscious," Caleb said, though blood trickled from his nose. "Bindings at 60% integrity. Maybe less. Nexum flow is ragged." Nissa coughed, spitting red. Her right hand was a mess of cuts and bedded crystal shards. "Remind me never to drink imperial vintage Nexum again." Aaron swayed, hand still pressed to her shoulder. His face had gone pale, sweat darkening his hair. "I diverted most of the surge," he managed, but it noticed. The Eidolon moved. Not a step, a ripple. Space around it warped, the air bending as if scorched without heat, Nexum twisting inside out. Its gaze fixed on Aaron, then on Lyrian, then on each of them in turn. You. Lines. Open. Lyrian felt something pry at her chakras, seeking leverage. Her root held she had spent too many years grounding herself in old forests and battlefield mud. Her solar bucked, enhancement trying to flare uncontrolled. She gritted her teeth and locked it down, forcing her Nexum to obey. The thing had found his heart. He dropped to his knees, both hands clutching his chest, as if something inside were trying to claw its way out. Green light flared around him, twisted into ropes, and then stretched toward the Eidolon like strands of spider silk, his giver nexus hijacked. "No," Lyrian snarled. Elemental Nexu roared through her. Roots exploded from the floor, not toward the Eidolon this time, but around Aaron, wrapping his torso, arms, and shoulders, forming a cage of living wood. The heart strands hit the roots instead, the Eidolon jerked, bark, restrained for a moment by the unexpected resistance in the Nexum lines. Aren seized the opening. With a wordless shout, he lunged into the circle's edge, fire lancing down his sword. He struck not at the Eidolon itself, but at a series of glyphs Caleb had pointed out seconds earlier with a glance and a desperate flick of his staff. Impact. Light detonated. For a heartbeat, Darren stood at the center of a sun, flames pouring from his solar chakra into the binding pattern. His enhancement nexus burned white-hot, feeding every drop of Nexum he had into the circle. The fragile balance tipped under the new weight. The Eidolon shrieked. Darren laughed, wild and exultant. Even "Tell as the fire Empire I said hello," he roared. Then he was gone. Body, armor, flames, pulled into the collapsing circle. The glyphs he'd struck shattered, sending shockwaves through the stone. Cracks spider-webbed across the dais, Nexum flashing and sputtering. "Darren!" Nissa screamed. The Eidolon's form twisted, compressed. For a moment, it seemed to shrink, forced back into the ring's fractured confines by the explosion of energy, and sacrificed. Then one of its chains snapped completely. It lunged. Nissa didn't have time to move. A tendril of shadow speared through her chest, emerging from her back in a spray of impossible darkness. She gasped, eyes wide, lips forming a curse that never left her throat. "Aaron," she choked. He tore one hand free of the roots, reaching for her. Her chakra flared. For an instant, Aaron did what sages had once been feared for. He reached not for flesh but for the thread of life itself, where Nexum clung to soul. He caught hers as it stretched, snapping and fraying. He held it, just energy long enough to pull him. Nissa's throat and heart Nexu surged along the line. Her life blurred, then shifted. Her body collapsed, empty. Aaron screamed again, but this time it was not in pain. It was in recoil. He staggered back as if struck, Nissa's last breath echoing in his lungs, her enchanter song caught in his throat. His Nexum channels burned with a pattern that wasn't entirely his. The Eidolon shuddered, tendril withdrawing. It did not understand what had happened, but it knew it had taken something, and something had been taken from it. Lyrian moved. She had lost 2 people and as many heartbeats. Grief was a blade in her ribs. But she did what she had always done with pain. She used it. "Calum!" she shouted, hurling her elemental Nexu into the circle's physical structure. Roots and stone intertwined, wrapping the remaining anchors like a living brace. "Now!" Calum cried back. He slammed his staff down, invoking the emergency ritual they had crafted in hushed arguments over travel fires and ink-stained maps, not to repair the imperial circle entirely. They lacked the power and knowledge for that, but to overlay it with a temporary net. A patch of Nexum woven atop the old. It was crude. It was desperate. Sometimes crystals exploded along his staff, shards of mana-infused quartz shooting out and embedding in the stones. Each shard carried a piece of a newer pattern, one designed to dampen and redirect instead of bind and torture. His Magi Nexus braided his own Nexum through the shards, tying them to the existing anchors. The chamber shook. Aaron, half dragged by the roots, half moving on his own, pushed himself upright. His heart felt scorched, yet something of Nissa's song still echoed there. He raised one hand, fingers trembling, and began to hum. It was not a song he'd ever learned. It poured out of him, because someone else had put it there seconds before dying. Nissa's enchanter Nexu flared through his throat, braided with his own heart and giver Nexus. The sound twined around Calum's emergency net, reinforcing it, tying the shards of crystal together in patterns they had not had time to design. The Eidolon roared. Chains of light snapped taut, then multiplied, new ones forming from the overlay. For a moment, the fragments formed blurred, stretched between the old circle and the hastily woven net. "I remember," said again, but this time the words were strained, distant, as if spoken through a wall. Lyrian stepped into the edge
Every
of the
instinct
circle. Screamed at her to stay back, but if they didn't hold the fragment now, in this moment of imbalance, it would break free within hours, days at most. She drew her blade. Elemental Nexu surged. Roots and vines exploded from the floor, wrapping her arms, bracing her legs, sinking into the stone, the glyphs. She became part of the circle, the living conduit the Empire had once used slaves for, but by choice, with full knowledge. Her enhancement nexus flared just enough to hold her body together against the strain. "Back," she shouted to Aaron and Calum. "Now." "Captain," Aaron began. "Go," she snarled. "That's an order." They hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, as the chamber's ceiling began to crack, they obeyed. Calum grabbed Aaron by the arm, dragging him toward the corridor even as Aaron's song continued, echoing off the stone. The improvised net held, for now. Lyrian's elemental roots fed it, drawing on every last scrap of her Nexum. The Eidolon reached for her, of course. Its tendrils brushed her brow and heart, seeking entrance, seeking to rewrite her Nexus. She denied it. Her root anchored her, rooted not only in stone but in memory, in the forest of her childhood, the laughter of her guildmates, the faces of Darren and Nissa, as they had been before this chamber stole them. "You don't get to have us," she hissed at the void fragment. "Not all of us." The binding flared. Calum and Aaron stumbled into the corridor as the chamber behind them erupted in light. The shockwave chased them, slamming them against the walls, stealing breath. Rocks began to fall. The mountain did not like what its heart was being forced to do. "Run!" Its own Nexum Calum shouted. They ran. The escape blurred. The corridor twisted, trying to fold them back toward the dying circle. Floors tilted, walls bent. For a few horrifying seconds, Aaron saw 2 paths ahead of him at once, both real, both shifting, Nexum illusions cast by a dying prison or a thrashing Eidolon. Elion was right, he thought distantly. The cave plays. He reached deep into his dimming chakra and did something he'd only ever practiced in training. He anchored his sense of direction not to his eyes or ears, but to his root and its Nexum. Down was down. Out was where Root felt weaker, where Sky waited. He pulled Calum within, shouting directions, half lucid. They ducked falling stones, leaped over widening cracks. At one point, a phantom Lyrian stood at an intersection, beckoning them back. Aaron's heart almost broke at the sight, but he recognized the wrongness in her Nexum signature. He tore his gaze away and ran the opposite direction. Behind them, the mountain roared. By the time they saw the slice of daylight ahead, Aaron could barely feel his legs. Calum's staff was a jagged half, crystals cracked and dim. His magi Nexum stretched thin. They burst out of the crack and collapsed onto moss and roots. The forest, gulping air, shuddered. A deep rumble rolled through Macha, sending birds screaming from the trees. Dust billowed from the crack as rocks shifted, settling. The opening shrank further, stone folding in like a wound healing with an ugly scar. Nexum lines dimmed as if drawing inward. Elion, a voice, distant, alarmed. A shadow loomed overhead. Then hands were on them, hauling them away from the cliff face. Elion's face swam into view. "Where are the others?" he demanded, voice hoarse. "Lyrian? Theron? Nissa?" Calum coughed, blood staining his lips. "Gone," he whispered. "2 to death. 1 to... hold. Their Nexum's in the stone now." Aaron stared at the closing crack, tears blurring his vision. His heart ached in ways he did not yet have names for. Nissa's song still flickered in his chest, a stubborn off-key echo. Bound to his giver Nexus. "She stayed," he said, "to keep it bound, to buy us and the mountain time." Elion's jaw clenched. He had known, when he saw the Silverthorn 5 approach, that some or all of them would never walk back down the mountain. Knowing did nothing to dull the reality. He bowed his head. "Then Etrusca owes her a debt," he said softly, "and your guild." Calum let out a ragged laugh. "You hate owing debts, Captain." "I do," Elion said, "but some are worth the discomfort." The mountain rumbled one last time, then fell silent, its Nexum settling into a new, uneasy balance. Aaron pressed his hand over his chest, feeling the faint hum of Nissa's last gift. The burn of Theron's sacrifice, the echo of Lyrian's rooted defiance woven into the binding far below, Elion asked. Calum looked up at Macha, at the scarred rock wall, at the dim sigils that still traced Nexum paths in the stone. "For a while," he said. "Our patch is crude. But with Lyrian's Nexu woven into it, and the mountain's own wards, I would say decades. Maybe centuries, if no one disturbs it. Nexum remembers. Long enough to let future fools think it's just a story," Elion said. "Stories are how elves remember," Calum replied. "Maybe that's what we need. To remember not to pry at every old wound in Nexum, just because we can feel it." Elion's gaze softened, just a fraction, as he looked between the 2 surviving guild members. "You'll come to Haville," he said. "You'll tell the council what happened." "And they'll what?" Aaron asked bitterly. "Issue another job posting in 100 years when the bindings fray again," Elion said. "Or perhaps they'll finally consider collapsing the mountain." Aaron flinched. "People live there. People die there," Elion said quietly. "Today, it was 3 of yours. Before, it was 4 of mine. Tomorrow, if we do nothing, it could be villages, forests, the country. Nexum doesn't care who it eats." Aaron looked up at the trees. They seemed quieter now, watching. Their own faint Nexum whispering through leaf and root. "Elves don't like other races," he said softly, voice thick. "You keep your dangers your own. But if that thing ever slips its chain..." "We will deal with it," Elion said. "We will not ask those lesser of us like the fairies, or Animori, or vampires, to bleed for our ancestors' arrogance. This is our mountain, our mistake." Aaron thought of Lyrian rooted in the circle, grip white-knuckled on her blade, of Theron laughing as he threw himself into fire, of Nissa's song echoing in his chest, braided into his Nexum. "It's not just yours anymore," he said. "Some of our blood is in that stone now, too." Elion met his gaze, something like respect flickering there. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "when the time comes, Our children can argue over whose turn it is to jump into the dark. For now, you live. That was their choice. I'll buy you that chance. He extended a hand to Aaron, then to Calum. Come, let's go tell a country that thinks itself immortal that its heart nearly stopped today. They rose. Behind them, the cave scar slowly cooled, its sigils dimming to faint, buried lines. The Bound Eidolon shifted in its deeper prison, chains bolstered by fresh sacrifice, its awareness pushed back into distant corners of the void between. But it did not forget. In the years that followed, elves told the story of the Silverthorn Five and the Forgotten Cave, of soldiers who stumbled into an imperial wound, of a guild that answered a call no one else wanted, of a captain who rooted herself in stone to keep a fragment of the void from walking the forests. They told it with pride, with grief, with the stubborn, haunted certainty of a people who understood that some deaths never truly ended, especially those written in Nexum. And sometimes on very quiet nights, when the wind slid down from the mountain in thin, cold fingers, those who listened with their Nexu could almost hear a faint song in the stone, off-key, stubborn, refusing, even in memory. You enjoyed this deep dive into the magical biology of the Grinnmere. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Until then, stay curious, and may your mana flow strong.